Hello. So, in this lecture, we are going to be considering what are often termed the oracles against the nations. And as we look at these texts, this is a collection of texts that we find in Jeremiah, we're actually going to be kind of considering how oracles against the nations function within the broader prophetic literature that we find in the Old Testament. But then we will pay special attention to how they function specifically within Jeremiah. So, now prophetic texts, just broadly speaking, can make some people, some readers feel a little bit squeamish, and probably no section does that more so than these, what again we call the oracles against the nations. See, a lot of the prophetic books, they do predict judgment, punishment. At least the prophets seem to be guided by a moral vision of justice. And we see that especially directed towards this concept of justice, directed towards the weak, the vulnerable in society. We've, looked at how specifically the strangers or the immigrants, widows, and orphans, those kind of represent, the most vulnerable within society, and the prophets are looking for justice on their behalf, or God is wanting justice on their behalf, speaking through the prophets. But these texts, these OANs, we can maybe refer to them, seem to present a more vindictive picture of God. At least it is a picture of God that seems more at odds with texts that portray God in a more loving and compassionate light. They can seem so out of place at times that some interpreters in the past have viewed them as really late additions to the prophets and not the part of the original work of the prophet. So Sigmund Mowinckel, who we've mentioned briefly before, he excludes Jeremiah's oracles against the nations from his discussion of the composition. When he, puts forth his theory, and you might remember this from some of your reading, when he puts forth his theory about the composition of the book, he argues that they were all added later, and so he doesn't really, give them much attention. So let's just consider a few of these texts from the book of Jeremiah. Now, the section that we're talking about when we're dealing with the OANs in Jeremiah, we're talking about chapters 46 through 51. This large chunk of text here. So I call them troubling texts. So the first one here, Jeremiah 46:10. For that day belongs to the Lord God of armies, a day of vengeance, so as to avenge himself on his foes. And the sword will devour and be satisfied, and drink its fill of their blood. For there will be a slaughter for the Lord God of armies, and the land of the north at the river Euphrates. So looking at these, the land of the north at the river Euphrates, looking at these foreign nations and saying there is going to be a slaughter. The sword will devour, drink its fill of blood. Wow. Yeah. Pretty dark, pretty gruesome stuff. Jeremiah 46:28. Jacob, my servant, do not fear, declares the Lord, for I am with you. For I will make a complete destruction of all the nations where I have driven you. Yet I will not make a complete destruction of you, but I will correct you properly and by no means leave you unpunished. This idea of making a complete destruction of these nations where they've been driven. And then further on, here's the last one to consider. In Jeremiah 48:8, a destroyer will come to every city so that no city will escape. The valley also will be ruined, and the plateau will be destroyed, as the Lord has said. So these are, again, I call them troubling texts. But what I want us to do is to examine these a little bit more closely, hopefully grow to appreciate the relevance of these texts to Christians today. Right? These are still part of the canon. These are part of our Bible, and they reveal to us important dimensions of God's character and who he is. Okay. Now, part of the difficulty of these texts, this is the first thing that isn't, I mean, it is kind of obvious when you stop and think about it, but we usually don't think of it right away. The nations that are condemned within these texts would have been very unlikely to ever hear this announcement of judgment that's spoken against them. When a prophet spoke a judgment against Tyre or Moab or Babylon or Assyria or Egypt, with very rare exception did they actually travel to the foreign nation to deliver the prophecy. It's possible something could have gone by messenger, but that certainly wasn't the primary audience. A very notable exception, of course, is in the story that we have of Jonah, which is a whole nother discussion. But very typically, the nations condemned would have never heard it. So that's the first thing, just to kind of keep in mind of why these texts are kind of troubling, because then we have to think, okay, who did hear these texts, and what would it have meant for them? Okay, what was being communicated to the people who did hear these texts and the primary audience? Okay, now I want to continue further and consider the origins of the OANs. Where did these texts come from? And then we're going to kind of trace that of how they were used in ancient Israel. Now, there are some examples of the OANs from the ancient Near East. So this is a form or a type of prophecy that is known from beyond the just biblical Israel, ancient Israel. We see it in a Sumerian text called the Curse of Agad or Akkad. So this is a text that was it's a Sumerian text, but this is concerning a ruler of the early empire. This is like early 3rd millennium of Akkad, or the Akkadian Empire. Sargon the First. He united Upper and Lower Mesopotamia. He united these and created this sort of first. A lot of people say this would have been the first true empire, and Sargon the First was very, very famous, revered kind of person, but his I think it was his grandson Naram Sin was a leader that came after him, and a lot of he made some decisions that a lot of people didn't like. One of the things he did was he wanted to be worshipped as a god. He said, as king of this. This was an early example of this, that someone wanted to be worshipped as a god. Naram Sin did this, and very shortly after, when the Akkadian Empire fell, they looked back to Naram Sin, and this sort of pride, this hubris, and the sins of Naram Sin is what caused this empire to fall. So that's just like a little bit of background context. But we see some of these cursings from the gods happening within this very early text. So as an example, here we go. Sorry, maybe it looks a little funny superimposed there. I should have put borders or something on it. Let's see if I can move that a little. Maybe it's a little bit more clear if I do like that. Okay. So reading down here from below line 220, it says, "A second time did Sin, Enki, Inanna, Ninurta, Ishkur, Utu, Nusku, and Nidaba, the great gods." So this is a list of these gods. "They direct their face to the city, curse a god with a baleful curse. City, you who dared assault the Akur, it is Enlil whom you assaulted. Agad, or Akkad, the titular city of the Akkadian Empire. You who dared assault the Akur, it is Enlil whom you assaulted." So here we have gods, in this ancient Near Eastern context, in the Sumerian text, that are cursing a city. Okay, this curse is coming against the city. So this is maybe a forerunner of this type of prophecy that we're dealing with, these OANs. Similarly, we have what are referred to as the Egyptian execration texts. So the Egyptian execration texts, these are, the curse of a god was late third millennium. These execration texts are early second millennium. So this is well before any of the biblical texts would have been written. These are forerunners of the biblical texts. And what would happen in these Egyptian execration texts is names of someone or a nation, a peoples to be cursed, would be written down on a bowl of pottery. And then that bowl of pottery would then be ceremonially smashed as a way of cursing the person whose name was written down. So I actually pulled a photo of this just so you can see. These are some potsherds. These are in a number of museums. I can't remember off the top of my head where these ones are from, but you see the writing that is on there that's Egyptian, and then during the ceremony, they would take and they would smash that text. Those are the Egyptian execration texts, and that could be directed against a foreign nation. Okay, 1 second here. I think I was going to show you another text, but I don't have it pulled up. But from the Mari text, which you read a little bit of the excerpts of that, we see some judgments against foreign nations delivered by prophets in some of the Mari texts, most specifically against Babylon during the reign of Zimri-Lin. It was also coincided with the reign of Hammurabi. They were kind of allied at first, and then they are no longer allies, and they became enemies. Eventually, Hammurabi sacked Mari, but there was a number of these texts that were curses, judgments against Babylon as a foreign nation. So that also would have been an early example. This was early second millennium. That's going to predate anything from the Bible. So those are some of the backgrounds that we see of, this prophetic form. We also have some examples from early biblical texts. So we have Balaam. This is in Numbers 22-24. If you remember the story, he's recruited by Balak, the king of Moab, to curse Israel. So that would have been a late second millennium example. The late, second millennium, we're talking between the years 1000 and 2000 BCE. So this would have been a late example, so closer to the year 1000. Really difficult to date, but you get the idea. At least you can place this as an early biblical text. And he's asked to curse Israel. He doesn't do it. It doesn't happen. There's a whole story with a donkey talking and everything like that. But evidently, this was something that was practiced. This was something that was done. In the battle between Goliath and David, read in 1 Samuel 17, before the battle, verse 43, we read that the Philistine Goliath is said to curse David, quote, by his gods, by the Philistines' gods. So he's invoking his gods in a cursing against David, who would have been a representative of the foreign nation of Israel. Well, so now that is, again, late second millennium. David is very close to the year 1000. So that's, where we would date that. And then, of course, we also have Elisha. Now, this one's a little bit different. It's not in the context of warfare, but we do see Elisha. He's cursing these antagonists, these young men, maybe kids, in the name of Yahweh. Now, that's early first millennium. Okay, this is after the year 1000, the early part. It certainly is predating the so-called classical prophets, beginning with Hosea and Amos, some of the early ones, Isaiah, Micah in the south. So Elisha's before all of them, and he curses in the name of Yahweh. So that's kind of related, the similar kind of concept. Okay, now, of course, we also have in the book of Jeremiah, this text, which is kind of revealing Jeremiah here, in addressing Hananiah, who, if you recall, was a false prophet. When Jeremiah says, "The prophets who were before me and before you from ancient times also prophesied against many lands and against great kingdoms regarding war and disaster and plague," because Jeremiah was prophesying, war, disaster, plague, and all these things. And so Jeremiah is saying, hey, look, I'm not doing anything new. Prophets before you and me from ancient times also prophesied, against other lands, other kingdoms regarding all these things. So that certainly would be another bit of evidence. Okay? Now, I want to refer to a couple scholars here. You hopefully remember and recognize these two. Hermann Gunkel, we learned about him from our study of form criticism. Now, if you recall, he was concerned, his primary interest was in helping to situate biblical texts in their original setting in life. That was the purpose of form criticism, what he referred to as the Sitzenleben, the original setting in life of the text. He wanted to find out, where did these things start? What was the social context of these biblical texts, and certainly with the prophets. So what he suggested is that possibly military expeditions would have been an original setting for where these OANs would have developed. So as you're going out to war, you're going on an expedition of war, and you're going to be marching against the land or meeting another army in battle on a field, or in that context, that's where these sort of cursings would have first been used. Now, he also suggested that the OANs were used in a cultic setting, maybe before the expedition. So before they would go on the expedition, they would go to the temple and they would worship, and they would pray and ask the gods for favor, for victory in their battle. And during that time, they would use that to also pronounce curses, invoking their gods to curse and punish the army that they're going to fight against. Now, following Gunkel, which a lot of people did, others suggest that maybe these oracles against the nations were used as a sort of response to public laments. If you recall laments, these are known from the book of Psalms, certainly very, very prominent, but known much from a much broader context than just the biblical text. Across ancient Israel, laments were used, and maybe cursing against a nation. If you're lamenting about how you're suffering at the hand of a nation, maybe a curse against the nation could function as a sort of response to the public lament. And we actually see this a number of times in the biblical text. One of the clearest examples is in Psalm 60. In Psalm 60, let me see if I'm able to pull this up. Yes, so in Psalm 60, let me go over here. Okay, here we go. So in verses 1 through 5, we have this lament that is addressed to God. And here you kind of see a little bit of it. God, you have rejected us. You have broken us. You have been angry. Restore us. This is very typical lament stuff. And they're lamenting about this. And that continues for the first 5 verses. But then verses 6 through 8, let me scroll down. We actually get God's response to the supplicant, wherein he announces his judgment against certain nations. And so, verse 6, God has spoken in his holiness, I will triumph. I will divide up Shechem and measure out the valley of Sukkoth. Gilead is mine, Manasseh is mine, Ephraim is the helmet of my head, Judah's, and, he goes on from there, and he's, I will throw my sandal over Edom. Shout loud, Philistia, because of me. This is where God is responding. And so maybe the idea is that these OANs functioned as a response within the cultic setting, within the temple setting, as people were making these public laments. It's kind of an interesting idea. We also see it in Lamentations 4, verses 17 through 20 is this collective lament addressed to Yahweh. And then verses 21 and 22 is a condemnation, of Edom, combined with an announcement of salvation to Zion. Now, this suggests maybe that oracles against the nation for Israel functioned as a salvation oracle. When the prophet was condemning a foreign nation, that, in effect, was an announcement of salvation for Israel. Okay? Now, that's Gunkel. Now, I want to look at Sigmund Mowinckel, which we've mentioned briefly before, Norwegian scholar of the Old Testament. He suggested a further cultic setting for the OANs, and that setting was actually in the royal court. Now, royal psalms emphasize the universal sovereignty of Yahweh. And, he is king. And so he suggests that the coronation rituals that we see, so Psalm 2, Psalm 110, that maybe those provide a possible setting for the OANs. So that was Sigmund Mowinckel. He thought that maybe these OANs had their genesis, their beginning within coronation rituals, as a king was crowned, reflecting God's kingship. That maybe through that whole act, there would be these pronouncements of judgment against other nations, possibly. Now, it is worth saying that those Egyptian execration texts, those bowls that they would write the names of nations or people to be cursed, they would smash them. That would happen during the middle of coronation ceremonies. So that's kind of an interesting take on this. Now, there is definitely some transformation of how these OANs would have functioned in ancient Israel. Now, we certainly see that in some sense they function as a sort of salvation oracle, rhetorically as a salvation oracle for Israel. The nations condemned, again, they likely never would have heard the oracle for themselves. I'm going to be drawing on an article. You have this in the additional resources. You can look through this article. It's really well done. This is by a scholar, Moon Kwan Che, and Horizons of Biblical Theology. And he has an article called Theological Reflections on the Oracles Against the Nations, and he outlines 3 significant transformations that these texts underwent. Okay, so we're going to be drawing somewhat from his article as we trace this. So the first stage. Now, the earliest, in the very, very beginning, oracles against the nations were just simply that. There were oracles against the nation, possibly, originating within these military expeditions, possibly coming from, as a response to public lament or these royal coronation ceremonies. That's the earliest. And then we have what we see in the biblical text is the first transformation stage is being transformed from salvation oracles for Israel. This is the announcement of their salvation. Their enemies are being cursed, to oracles against Israel. And Amos, possibly the very first of the classical prophets, is right where we see this. Actually, in the opening of the book, before we get to chapter 5, this text here, in chapters 1 and 2, Amos, he opens with this series of oracles against other nations that's addressing all of the nations surrounding Israel. I can't remember where I think it starts in the north and it just kind of works its way down. And then as you read through this and you kind of look at the nations that are being addressed on a map, you begin to realize that he's like encircled the nation of Israel. He's a prophet to the nation, the northern state of Israel. And he has completely encircled the nation. And then finally, at the end, in chapter 2, he gives the punishment against Israel itself. They're probably cheering on the prophet as he's condemning their neighbors. But then when he gets to condemning them, then they realize, oh, these are becoming against us too. And we see it again in chapter 5 in this text here. He transforms the day of Yahweh, the day of the Lord, from being a day of salvation to being a day of judgment against Israel. So chapter 5:18, woe to you who are longing for the day of the Lord. He's addressing people that they thought, day of the Lord, this is woohoo, all right, day of the Lord, God's going to get our enemies. And Amos comes along and says, woe to you who are longing. What purpose will the day be for you? It will be darkness and not light, and begins to announce their judgment there. We also see it in Isaiah in a more subtle way. Perhaps with a little bit more literary sophistication than Amos. Isaiah is just a magnificent writer. And here we have the nation, Judah, had been turning to other nations for salvation. Instead of Yahweh, they're looking to other nations to save them, whether it's Assyria or Egypt or someone else. They're looking to how can they protect themselves. Now, what Isaiah does is he makes this theological point that should Judah choose to align themselves with other nations, they could expect the same judgment that is announced in the oracles against those nations. So in other words, they can themselves become the enemy. All right, so that's the first stage. The second stage is a shifting to a cosmic depiction of the enemy, a cosmic depiction of the enemy. So the nations end up becoming these typological symbols for spiritual forces that are opposed to Yahweh's sovereign rule over all creation. Okay? This is, typological symbols for spiritual forces that are opposed to Yahweh's sovereign rule over all creation. The imagery of the nations then becomes more mythic and symbolic of chaotic forces. Okay, this is going back deep into, the roots of ancient Near Eastern mythology. In Ezekiel, we certainly do see this. Further along in Israel's history, he's an exilic prophet. In Ezekiel, the descriptions of the oracles against Egypt in chapters 29 to 32 and Tyre, they take on, in chapters 26 to 28, they take on this mythic dimension. So we read in Ezekiel 28:2, Son of man, that's Ezekiel, say to the leader of Tyre, the Lord God says this, because your heart is haughty, and you have said, I am a god. I sit in the seat of gods, in the heart of the seas. Yet you are immortal and not God, although you make your heart like the heart of God. So, here in this, this idea, there's more this mythic element. He claims to, he says, I'm a god and I sit among the gods in the heart of the seas. Well, he doesn't literally do that. This is some hubris. This is, drawing from the imagery of ancient Near Eastern mythology. In Jeremiah itself, in chapters 50 and 51, Babylon is judged there, but Babylon is functioning in those texts as a symbol for oppression and violence and idolatrous world power. That's how Che puts it in his. He says they're a symbol of oppression, violence, and idolatrous world power, unlike other oracles against Babylon and the prophets. In Jeremiah 50 and 51, it lacks the commonly found historical allusions. It just has this more mythic quality to it. Now, the symbol of Babylon as a representation of worldly systems of power, pride, and oppression, we see that in other places in the Bible as well. Babylon functions as that sort of symbol. We see it in the Tower of Babel, which the word Babel is just the same word as Babylon. We certainly see it also in the use of Babylon as it functions in the book of the Revelation and the New Testament. Babylon is functioning as the symbolic representation of worldly systems of power and pride and oppression and these things. So Che writes in his article, he says, with the loss of the Davidic kingdom, with the loss of the Davidic kingship and statehood, the battle between Israel and our national enemies was transformed into the battle between Yahweh and his cosmic enemies. So again, Ezekiel, the text that we looked at, that's an exilic text. So the state has fallen, the kingship has fallen at that point. And so this, the battle between the state of Israel and their national enemies, it gets transformed. This is now the battle between Yahweh and the cosmic enemy. Okay. Now, this is doing good. Stage 3, then, the OANs originate as these nationalistic oracles of salvation for Israel vis-a-vis the judgment of the nations. Okay, it's salvation for Israel because the nations are being judged. In the final stage, though, the nations are then going to be envisioned as participating in the future restoration. So, for example, in the middle of Isaiah's large block of oracles against nations, chapters 13 through 23 in Isaiah, Egypt and Assyria are included in Yahweh's blessing of Israel. And so we read Isaiah 19, 24 through 25, on that day, Israel will be the third party to Egypt and Assyria, a blessing in the midst of the earth, whom the Lord of armies has blessed, saying, blessed is Egypt, my people, and Assyria, the work of my hands, and Israel, my inheritance. These three get lumped together as, participating in this blessing. In Jeremiah's block of oracles against nations, as you read through the text, hopefully you caught that it includes blessings for 4 nations, for Elam, for Egypt, for Ammon, and for Moab. They get to participate. It ends within the prophecies against these nations and in these announcement of blessings. Okay? So, now I want to consider a little bit the theology of the oracles against the nation with reference to these stages of development. So what we're doing here, this is called a diachronic study. We're looking at how these oracles against nations functioned over a period of time. This is called a diachronic approach. There's also synchronic approaches. This happens to be a diachronic approach. Now, a central theme that we can see that does emerge from the oracles against the nations is the kingship of Yahweh, that Yahweh is sovereign king. Now, in this first stage, which was the transition from salvation oracles to oracles against Israel, that Israel could be judged, many in Israel, and we saw this definitely within the book of Jeremiah, they operated under this false idea that Yahweh always fights on behalf of his people. Now this, that we certainly see as it plays out, is now invalid. This idea is certainly not true. Yahweh may fight against Israel. So Yahweh's kingship is not automatically aligned with Israelite kingship. Or put in another way, Yahweh's kingship is not defined by Israel. Rather, Israel is defined by Yahweh's kingship. Okay, it's a whole switch that's happening here. In stage 2, we have reference to, we see this development of the cosmic depiction of the enemy. Now, with the destruction of Jerusalem and the monarchy with it, Yahweh's kingship, we see it's reimagined in cosmic and mythic terms. The enemy is not merely earthly kingdoms, but all symbols, or symbols of all forces that are opposed to Yahweh's kingdom. Anything that is opposed to the kingdom of God, in a sense, becomes the enemy, essentially. So the sole hope of future restoration is in Yahweh himself. So after the fall of the monarchy, Israel looks to Yahweh's sole kingship for hope and future restoration. That's the only place that's going to be found. And then in stage 3, when we have the restoration of the nations, it's the shift of Yahweh's kingship to these cosmic dimensions that led to the inclusion of all nations and the hope for restoration. The scope of Yahweh's kingship is universal. It's way beyond just the nation of Israel. That's kind of where we end up through these 3 stages. It's beyond the nation of Israel. It's universal, and it includes all nations. And that means God's promises of blessings also include all nations. Okay? And certainly we see some very important missiological implications within that concept, that this blessing is in fact for all nations. And it is our privilege, it is our honor and our obligation to announce that blessing that is for all nations. Now, let's just briefly consider here the function of the oracles against the nations within the book of Jeremiah. So Jeremiah's mission, let's first start there. In his commissioning that happens in chapter 1, he is appointed a prophet not only to Judah, but also concerning the nations. In Jeremiah 1:10, it says, "See, I have appointed you this day over the nations and over the kingdoms, to root out and to tear down, to destroy and to overthrow, to build and to plant." So he is over the nations and over kingdoms. That's something that should be in our minds when we start out reading the book of Jeremiah. And so we see that oracles against nations are very much appropriate to find within the book of Jeremiah. So looking at the major sections of Jeremiah, chapters 2 through 25, this is largely a series of prophetic judgments against Judah. This is the first major section that we have, these prophecies focused on the judgment of Judah. And we, at the end of this section, in chapter 25, Jeremiah 25, describes how the nations are going to drink from the cup of God's wrath. Babylon will serve as God's instrument of judgment against the nations, Judah in particular, but they in turn are going to be punished. Okay, so this is how this first major section then is concluded. In 25:15, "For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says to me, take this cup of the wine of wrath from my hand and give it to all the nations to whom I send you to drink from it." They are going to drink from the cup of God's wrath. Okay, now the next section that we get to is 26 through 45. Now this is, I'm really condensing things here. There's, of course, more within that, but these generally describe a sort of narrative fulfillment of God's judgment of Judah. That's what we see playing out largely. 2 through 25 is, God's prophetic judgments against Judah, and then 26 through 45, we see how that becomes fulfilled. So it has more of this narrative voice. And then in the final section, 46 through 51, the oracles against the nations then follow. This is where we have God's judgment against the nations. They bring a fitting conclusion to the book of the prophet who is appointed, again, over nations and over kingdoms. In the end, I think the oracles against the nations can teach us a very important theological truth, that Yahweh was not just the God of Israel, but was in fact the sovereign Lord of all creation. This is part of the reason why these texts are so valuable, because they really underscore this point. And just as the nations, just as Israel is the object of God's love and God's blessing, Israel can also be punished. The nations can be the object of God's judgment, but the nations in turn can also be blessed. And there's this sort of universal scope of Yahweh's kingship that then gets underscored. So, and there's the bibliography. You can see some important resources, including the article by Che. You can look through and read those. And this concludes our final lecture. Thank you.